Our next speaker is Dr. Ben Kong, who's going to discuss a clinical trials update with us. Dr. Kong is a medical oncologist and cancer researcher with interest in clinical trials, immuno-oncology and translational research. He trained in general medicine at Concord Hospital and medical oncology at Westmead Hospital. In addition to his clinical duties, Ben is currently an Oncology Research Fellow with Cogno at the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre and a Senior Research Fellow with the Sphere Cancer Clinical Academic Group at University of New South Wales. Please welcome Dr. Kong.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Marina, for the kind introduction. If you run into me in the hallway later, please just call me Ben. I'm very embarrassed by all these sort of introductions and talking about all my background. I'd like to start by thanking BTAA and the Brain Cancer Group for the invitation to speak today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to patients and their carers about clinical trials. Obviously, this is a large part of what I and what we all do here, but it's a real pleasure to be able to communicate this to you. Before I get started today, this is what I'd like to cover today. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about why brain cancer trials are a little bit different, to outline to you a little bit about the Australian clinical trial landscape, and then most importantly also speak to you about how you as patients and carers can shape the future of trials, because everything that we do here is of course done for patients, and so that's a critical part of what we do in research and in medicine. I'm going to start today by offering you a little bit of reassurance. So I'm going to show you two slides that I think tell you everything that you need to know about clinical trials in brain cancer in Australia. One of the very frequently asked questions we have in clinic when patients come to see us is something that sounds pretty obvious. Am I getting the best treatment, doctor? What is this that you're talking to me about? Are there other alternatives? This is some research that we did within Cogno, actually looking at some of the trials done internationally and comparing what we do in Australia to try and determine whether we can do better and how we can do better. I've highlighted two really important things here. Unfortunately, the chairs down the bottom are hiding the most important information here. But what I want to really show here is that in Australia, although we are a relatively small population, you will see that we do pretty well in terms of the number of neuro-oncology trials and also the number of trials that we run, not just in Australia, but internationally. So we have a lot of collaborations with other countries. And so as patients, you should have confidence that the treatment that you are getting, whether that be standard treatment or in clinical trials, is in inverted commas, the best treatment. I've also highlighted what you can see here is a bit of an outlier, and I think that's really important because as patients, one of the and carers, one of the most stressful things in addition to your diagnosis is hearing about advice, whether that be from well-meaning friends and family about all these other things that are out there, and it's very easy to think that maybe you're not getting the best treatment. And so today I'm going to speak to you a little bit about what goes on in other countries. And you'll see in the United States of America, there's a big number of apparent neuro-oncology trials, and many of those trials are things which are perhaps early phase trials, things that you may hear about in the media and things that you may think about as you go through your treatment journey. And I think it's really important as patients to consider when you look for information on the internet You may not know that the United States and New Zealand are one of only 2 countries in the world where it's legal to directly advertise drugs to patients. So when you turn on the TV, there you'll see advertisements for new drugs, and so that influences what you see when you go about searching and researching these pieces of information. So those things are important things to keep in mind, and that's why I've started my talk with that today. Why is brain cancer so unique? So brain cancer is a relatively rarer type of tumour. It affects fewer people compared to other cancers, and so in brain cancer, hopefully you can see here that there are a large number of early phase clinical trials. So up here at the top, phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, this sort of proportion is much higher in brain cancer than other types of tumours. So this means that designing brain cancer trials with appropriate comparators is very challenging, and so many of the trials you'll see by their nature are in single centres. There may be many more that are funded by philanthropy or government rather than pharmaceutical companies, and so obviously that influences some of the information that you hear. So I thought it important to highlight these 2 things to offer you reassurance as we go through some of the trials that we're going to talk about today. So what's the trial landscape in Australia look like? Before I start this, I'm going to offer a disclaimer. This is very heavily oriented towards medical and drug treatment trials. I can only talk about adults today. Paediatric trials are probably another big area, and so this is a heavily editorialised list of trials I'm going to talk about today. As no doubt BTA and many other groups would be very aware, one of the very large trials that is coming to Australia soon is an international trial called GBM Agile. So in brain cancer, and as with many other cancers, we have always run trials by looking at new interventions, randomising that intervention to our old previous standard of care, and then recording the outcome, and step by step looking at whether new treatments are useful or not. GBM Agile is an international platform, and that's been brought to Australia by many stakeholders, and this is an adaptive trial platform, so looking at patients with newly diagnosed and recurrent glioblastoma, but doing so in a fashion that allows us to quickly determine whether new treatments are useful or not, and then quickly moving patients on to other treatments that may show early signs of efficacy. This platform is designed for both newly diagnosed and recurrent glioblastoma, and as you can see here, some of these drugs which are coming in are fairly new, so these patient groups may be looking at finding safety or dose finding studies, determining whether these drugs are useful, and then looking to trial them in larger patient groups. So I've listed here some of the types of drugs that are going to be in this platform. We won't necessarily have all of these in Australia, but these are drugs which are peptides, not just small molecule compounds. They're drugs that may modulate the tumour metabolic processes, and also some old favourite drugs that we've used in other types of tumours, so drugs that target specific cell surface receptors in glioblastoma. Now, because GBM Agile did take some time to come to Australia, in Cogno we decided to, in the meantime, whilst we're waiting for this, design our own multi-platform study. Many of you may have heard about the MAGMA study, which is a national trial platform where we had a multi-arm, multi-stage study, and this actually involved many centres in Australia. So in our particular trial in Cogno, although this is completed accrual, we were looking initially at questions of how to best use our standard of care drug temozolomide and the timing with which that was used in brain cancer. So this is an ongoing study where we are still looking at outcomes from this study, but it showed that in Australia we have the capacity and more importantly the patient willingness to participate in this sort of national research. So I wanted to highlight that. Okay, so a couple of Cogno trials that are coming up and going on soon. In recurrent low-grade glioma, we soon have in fact we have open now, but we'll have soon more sites open for the LUMOS-2 trial. This is a trial in recurrent low-grade glioma incorporating molecular screening in patients with a platform to trial novel drugs for this underserved patient population. And fortunately, this is also being run in collaboration with the Canadian Brain Cancer Trial Group, so some international collaborations to help achieve some scale and allow us to bring additional drugs to this underserved patient group, of course. The LUMOS-2 trial is very unique in the sense that we are looking at participants' real-time molecular profiles and seeking to match those molecular profiles with drugs. So these are some of the initial arms in the trial. Paxalicib is a drug that's being used in the GBM Agile trial, looking at patients with PIK3 kinase mutations, but also we have some novel drugs, including some immunotherapy drugs. So patients who may not have an actionable mutation in their tumour nevertheless get the opportunity to try new drugs. So this is in some respects a phase 2 trial where we're seeking to look at the activity of these medications which otherwise may not be used in this patient population. So again, with the theme of platform trials here and trying to achieve the scale to help as many patients as possible. Cogno also has collaborations internationally with the European Organisation for Research and Treatment of Cancer, EORTC. PersoMed is a trial which is designed to treat a relatively rarer type of tumour, medulloblastoma. This is again a national and international collaboration, particularly looking at the use of novel agent sunitinib, which is a targeted agent against sonic hedgehog. So this is looking to change the paradigm of care for some of these patients, which involves intensive chemotherapy and radiotherapy to add novel targeted agents. And so this is quite a complex trial, and I won't go through the mechanism in all detail, but essentially, as well as looking at new drugs, we're looking to try to look at new standards of care with how we use our standard treatments like radiation. So instead of using such an intensive radiation treatment, seeing where the addition of new drugs can actually change that standard of care. So those three trials are ones I wanted to highlight as platform trials because Australia being a relatively smaller country and brain cancer being a relatively rarer type of tumour, these types of platforms are important, and as patients and carers, I believe you should have confidence that we have the ability to participate in these types of trials, whether they be national or international. I'm going to go into some relatively rarer tumour types to talk about some of the smaller trials that you may not hear about, but put this in the context of brain cancer in general. So this diagram here is a diagram of some of the genetic mutations that you might find in brain cancer from a global TCGA collaboration. You don't need to be a scientist or doctor to see that in these individual patient samples, these are individual genetic mutations. There's lots of different colours in there, and all of these circles look different. So that means that when we're looking for a targeted therapy in brain cancer, it's a very challenging proposition. So finding one drug against one target may not be a cure-all for this sort of condition. And in adult brain cancers, it's a very different situation to paediatric brain cancers, where we see a lot of these mutations. So obviously, designing clinical trials is a bit of a challenge. Nevertheless, we are fortunate to be, again, part of a national platform for screening genetic mutations in cancer, of which the LUMOS-2 is one example. Cogno and other groups are working carefully with the molecular screening and therapeutics program to look for these sorts of genetic mutations in brain cancer patients. And two of the mutations which are relatively rare in brain cancer do actually have corresponding drugs which are part of this platform. BRAF V600E is a mutation that is found in many cancers. In melanoma, it's found in about 30% of patients. In glioblastoma, unfortunately, it's only about 2 or 3% of patients. And drugs targeted against this mutation are approved in the US for use against this type of brain cancer. In Australia, although this is not specifically approved for use, we do have access to some of these drugs in the most platforms. So for example here, the vemurafenib and cobimetinib are available, and I've actually put one of my patients on this particular study. Another type of rarer mutation is an NTRK fusion, found in many types of cancers, but also in glioma. We don't know the exact prevalence of this in adult gliomas, but through the MOST program, these medications are available in some fashion for patients. Just very briefly, cellular therapy is something which is very topical in brain cancer. CAR T cells are used in many hematological cancers, and these are genetically engineered T cells taken from patients and then reinfused back into them. These have been very successful in blood cancers, not so much in brain cancer due to the immunological microenvironment, which we could spend all day talking about, but nevertheless there are some trials going on, and in fact I believe at this moment in Adelaide there's a small pilot study looking at the use of CAR T cells, particularly in a patient population called the GD2 positive glioblastoma. So this is just a small trial, but nevertheless I see this as sort of grassroots starting of immunological mechanisms in brain cancer. I've done a little straw poll of some of my colleagues in brain cancer, and again this is just a small list of some of the very small trials that are going on. This list changes very frequently, but you can see here we've got some vaccine trials going on or due to start in Australia, some smaller phase studies with targeted drugs, and then also again pharmaceutical trials in very rare patient populations such as midline glioma. So I'm putting this up here not to try and have a comprehensive list, but to give you an idea that there are all these small things going on that you may not see commonly, and it's very important to engage as you are doing today to find out about these as patients and carers. Now just to end off, I've just got a couple of very short slides about immunotherapy. This is very topical. Sorry, I'm running a bit over time there. But this is an important topic that I'm sure everyone's interested in. I'm bringing this up because immunotherapy is something that we are just at the tip of the iceberg in discovering, and I'm sure you've all heard about immunotherapy targeting T cells that's used in many other types of cancers like lung cancer and melanoma and pretty much all other sorts of solid tumours. In brain cancer, this has been a bit more of a challenging proposition, but I'm just going to very briefly go through a couple of mechanisms that I think are important where there may be clinical trials in the near future, and there are some small trials, perhaps not all run in Australia, where this is going on. Viruses are one important aspect of immunotherapy. We've all been through the COVID-19 pandemic and know that now viruses and their components can be used as treatments. AstraZeneca virus is a adenovirus vector that was used to treat or prevent COVID-19, and similarly in glioblastoma there have been some studies looking at the poliovirus and how we can use that to target cell adhesion molecules in glioblastoma. So there's been a small study, phase 1 study, reporting some promising data in this aspect, and currently there is a phase 2 trial going on. Unfortunately not in Australia, but nevertheless an interesting mechanism to keep an eye out for. Neoantigen vaccines are another type of vaccine where we can take patients' tumours and look at their not just the genetic mutations, but the makeup of the antigens or the immune components that make their tumour very unique. And again, there have been some small trials internationally where people have been able to do this. And this diagram I put up here to show you the sort of infrastructure that's needed to run a very small trial like this. So this is why it's a bit of a challenge, but nevertheless hopeful that this technology is being developed, and I'm sure that we'll see maybe not identical, but very similar things here in Australia in the near future. And so this is being given with or without current immunotherapies. So this is the area of personalised vaccines that we are hopeful there will be advances in glioblastoma and other types of brain tumours. One of the really important aspects of what we're doing here in Australia as a relatively small population is to take advantage of the fact that we have a very collaborative network here. You may know that very recently the Australian Brain Cancer Registry platform received government funding. This is a national platform involving many stakeholders, led by Brain Cancer Biobanking Australia, and this is a platform aimed at ensuring that we learn from every patient, that we standardise the data we are collecting, and for patients and their carers, most importantly, this is going to advance research into biomarkers to enable some of these new platforms to come through, or at least that's the hope, and so you may hear more about this in the near future. As patients and carers, it's important also to be aware of what's happening in the laboratory. This is something which I struggle to keep on top of myself, but just late at night I was preparing this talk, I was thinking a couple of the scientists who you may not have heard of, but some of whom are here today are working on some of these things in the laboratory. So we have people right here in Sydney working on adenoviral vectors for glioblastoma. As I mentioned earlier, we have scientists working on CAR T cells in preclinical models, and also other types of mechanisms, particularly in the immunotherapy space. So as patients and participants in clinical trials and carers, what can you do to engage with this community and engage with all these things? You can certainly help us as doctors and scientists to advance this. So I encourage you to celebrate our scientists in the lab, engage them, stalk them on Twitter, ask questions. That helps us to think of better ways to do things. As patients, your views on the infrastructure to fund and conduct trials, as you can see from the Australian National Brain Cancer Registry, and your feedback about these things is important. And lastly, of course, we should acknowledge that patients who are willing to participate in trials, we're all very grateful for your participation to help advance the cause and also help people in the future. So with that, I'll end my presentation today, and certainly if you have any questions or comments later, I'd be happy to chat to you in the hallway.